We'll begin in just a moment. Let's see. Okay. Video. Stop share. Good afternoon. My name is John Tucker, and I'm the president of the Pitt County Historical Society, and it's an honor for me to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture. Dr. David Dennard, Emeritus Professor of History at East Carolina University, will be talking with us. His topic is Making the Case for Black History Month in 2022 and beyond. We're very thankful to have David's participation. He's coming out of retirement to do this for us, and we look forward to his remarks. If you have questions, comments, or anything that you want to add to his remarks, please have them submitted to us if you're attending virtually. And there are quite a few of you out there virtually. There's a fair audience here in person, and we appreciate your being here. But virtually, if you're attending and you want to participate, you understand, of course, that as a webinar, you can't offer comments. We can't see you. We know that you're out there. But nevertheless, if you do want to make a remark for the speaker, please enter them through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That way we'll have them in the order that they were submitted and be able to click them off easily enough. In any event, to return to this, David will be joining us shortly. I do want to mention that we have a couple of more events scheduled for the spring. In March, we'll be having a webinar broadcast from the Aden Historical Museum. And in April, Dr. Walter Porres will be talking about his memories of the Holocaust. And perhaps we'll have another event scheduled for May. But more information on those can be gotten from our website, pittcountyhistoricalsociety.com. Then go to the events tab, and you'll be able to see the specifics as they unfold. David was a faculty when I joined the faculty here at ECU in 2000. He recently retired. At the time when I came to East Carolina, I didn't realize quite what his historical significance was. Over time, it was towards the end of his career as a professor. It dawned on me, in connection with my work as university historian, as well as teaching East Asian history, that he wasn't just a professor and an African-American. He was the first African-American professor of history at East Carolina University. And so in that respect, one of the many pioneers at the faculty level who has contributed significantly to the desegregation of the institution, a slow but sure process that continues to unfold at a molasses-like pace, but nevertheless, change does happen. And so I've come to appreciate David even more than I ever did when we were actually active colleagues. And then on another count, I want to call your attention to something that he did in connection with my work as the university historian. In addition to a project that he worked with Dr. Don Inslee on Black physicians in Eastern North Carolina and their contributions to healthcare in the larger community, the region, David also conducted an interview with one of the most important figures in the desegregation process at East Carolina University, Laura Marie Leary Elliott. And he did so just months before Mrs. Elliott passed away, making that conversation and the records that he was able to preserve through it all the more valuable for people like me and for anybody who studies East Carolina history in years to come. Had David not conducted that interview, we would know, unfortunately, precious little, and probably we would have a tendency to imagine all sorts of things about Mrs. Elliott's experience at East Carolina. I won't go into the details, but I will encourage you to track that interview down. It's recorded online, and there's a transcript, if I'm not mistaken, available as well. It's not the happiest account. It's not the happiest story, but it was what happened, and it came from her as communicated to David. I had the good fortune of meeting Mrs. Elliott on one occasion when she came back to campus, the first time she had come back to campus since she graduated. And she told me at that point, I mentioned to her that I would like to talk with her further. And she told me, well, you better hurry. She didn't tell me why. I later understood. She apparently understood herself that she had cancer and would be gone within 6 months. So in any event, David did track her down and did have a conversation with her. And thank goodness that he contributed in that very important way to ECU University history. So without further ado, I want to turn the podium and the microphone over to David. And again, remind those who are attending virtually, if you have questions or comments or observations or anything that you want to communicate to us, to submit your comments through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So now, if you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Dennard.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Tucker, my colleague, for gracious remarks. I hope I will not change the tenor of his comments after I have made this presentation. But I do miss all of my colleagues here dearly, and I'm not gone yet, John. Okay. So I'm delighted to join you today. And again, I thank my colleague, Dr. Tucker, for extending me an invitation to make a Black History Month presentation during this month of February 2022. I thank all of the co-sponsors as well for the support in making this event possible. The Pitt County Historical Society, ECU Academic Library Services, and the ECU Department of History. I also want to thank in advance all attendees who are here in the Faulkner Gallery of Joyner Library and others who are attending virtually. I recall my last visit here in the Faulkner Gallery was in 2019. On February 13th and March 6th, I led a book discussion on Zora Neale Hurston's book, Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo. My purpose here today is to give a Black History Month talk on the title, Making the Case for Black History Month 2022 and Beyond. My primary objective this afternoon is to address or focus on 3 points. First, I want to give a Black History Month posthumous shout out or salute to Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the African-American historian who began an observance in 1926 that is still relevant, powerful, and historically important in 2022. Black History Week, which is now Black History Month, has been in existence for a total of 96 years. Second, I want to indicate very strongly the import and significance that Black History Month holds for white Americans. This year, and for many years to come, white Americans must devise strategies and develop the mental toughness necessary to make themselves whole and to repair some of the damages, some of the damage done to their African-American brothers and sisters. There is much to learn from whiteness studies and the deconstruction of whiteness. Third, and finally, I shall argue that Black History Month is an important point of departure or tool in our toolkit to use as we begin a nationwide reclamation project for a lost generation of African Americans. Here, I have reference to those African Americans who experienced firsthand the apparently unintended, but nevertheless damaging side effects of desegregation and the residual consequences that constitute or that continue to trickle down to African American millennials and Gen Zers. For clarity, I am categorizing millennials as anyone born between 1980 and 1995, and Gen Zers as anyone born between 1997 and 2012. Since becoming familiar with his life and work, I have been totally amazed by what Dr. Carter G. Woodson accomplished and the manner in which he worked single-handedly and with a laser-like focus to prevent African Americans from becoming what he often said, and I quote, a negligible factor in the thought of the world, end of quote. As he came of age and matured, this son of former slaves developed the habit of saying that, and I quote here, if a race has no history, if it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. What is particularly impressive about this historian that we refer to today as the father of Black history is that he found a way to establish a foundation upon which African Americans could stand and say, as James Brown, the godfather of soul, exclaimed in a song in 1968, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. Brown recorded the song 42 years after Dr. Woodson began the observance of Negro History Week. And the song came 53 years after Dr. Woodson and a few other African Americans founded the Association for the Study of Negro History, which became the launching pad for Black History Week, the Journal of Negro History, the Negro History Bulletin, and the Associated Publishers. The broad and specific mission of the association was then and still is to promote, research, preserve, interpret, and disseminate information about Black life, history, and culture to the global community. Now, before this African American could establish an infrastructure devoted to documenting the history of African Americans, one that would remain extant for more than a century, he had to find a way to develop those skills or the education that would make it possible for him to do what he ultimately would do. When Dr. Woodson was born in 1875, for example, just 2 years before the official end of Reconstruction in 1877, African Americans were experiencing a major reversal after having enjoyed some mountaintop fruit between 1865 and 1877. The 13th Amendment, which abolished chattel slavery, had been passed in 1865. The 14th Amendment, which made African Americans citizens, had been passed in 1868. And the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, proclaimed that persons should not be denied the right to vote on the basis of race, creed, color, or previous conditions of servitude. These three amendments changed a pro-slavery American Constitution to one that granted Blacks legal rights that placed them on an equal constitutional footing with white Americans. The period between 1865 and 1877 was the time when Black men received the franchise and held elective office for the first time in American history. When Woodson was born and coming of age, however, African Americans were being stripped of their newly won rights and were being pushed back down in the valley towards a new form of slavery, a form of slavery maybe by another name, and a system dressed and cloaked in the devilish and destructive garbs of Jim Crow laws. The era Professor Michelle Alexander, the scholar who writes about the new Jim Crow of our times, was not the new Jim Crow, but this was the old Jim Crow. This was the Jim Crow that lasted in legal form until the middle of the 1960s, when it came down after having been challenged directly by African-American men, women, boys, and girls who faced angry dogs, water hoses, and the billy clubs of white sheriffs and white police officers. Indeed, in 1875, the year that Dr. Woodson was born, the curtain of white supremacy was coming down across the United States. And as former Morehouse College President Benjamin Mays reported, books and articles were being published, sermons preached, and anti-Negro speeches made, all saying in substance, and I quote, "The Negro is a different breed. He is inferior to the white man. At any cost, he must be kept down," end quote. This was a high point of lynching, a period punctuated with the bloody Wilmington, North Carolina coup d'etat of 1898, the Atlanta race riot of 1906, the Springfield, Illinois race riot of 1908, and many other violent Black-white clashes. The African-American historian Raphael W. Logan assessed the plight of African-Americans at the opening of the 20th century and characterized this time as the nadir era for African-Americans. It was a trek from the mountaintop back down into the valley of oppression. Yet during this low point in the history of African-Americans, Carter G. Woodson, like many other African-Americans at the time, simply refused to accept the definition imposed and prescribed by the larger white society. Unfortunately, Dr. Woodson did not leave us a memoir or autobiography detailing how he navigated the turbulent waters and forces of Jim Crow segregation and white supremacy. But we know that this lad, who once worked in the coal mines of West Virginia and who even drove a garbage truck in Buckingham County, found a way to earn a high school diploma from Frederick Douglass High School in Huntington in 1897. That he found a way to earn a BS degree from Berea College in 1903. That he was awarded an AB, that he was awarded AB and MA and AM degrees from the University of Chicago in 1908, and a PhD in history from Harvard University in 1912. Woodson was only the second African-American to earn a doctoral degree from Harvard and the first and only student of former slaves to earn a PhD degree from Harvard. Woodson followed W.B. Du Bois, who was the first African-American to earn a PhD degree from Harvard in 1895. Woodson has never been described as a radical or Black nationalist, but the preponderance of evidence identify him as a stubborn man, a man fiercely proud of his race and one who refused to kowtow to anyone who would rob him of his integrity and independence. And Woodson's principal biographer, Jacqueline Goggin, credits his father for teaching him his most important lesson. And this scholar, as this scholar put it, although Woodson, I'm quoting, although Woodson's father remained illiterate all of his life, and despite his poverty, James Henry Woodson would not accept handouts from whites and taught his children to be polite to everybody, but to insist always on recognition as human beings. And if necessary, fight to the limit for it, end of quote. In sum, the father commanded his children to never accept insult from whites, compromise their principles, mislead their fellow men, or betray their people. Now, while the particular details are not found in Dr. Woodson's papers and publications, it is nevertheless clear to those who have studied this historian and his principal teachers at Harvard that a clash of values and principles occurred at Harvard during Woodson's matriculation. In the main, the prevailing view held and articulated by his professors of history at Harvard, especially Albert Bushnell Hart and Edward Channing, was that the Negro had not made a contribution to world history or American history. Instead, wherever the Negro was found, he had simply been a problem, if not a sheer menace to society. Woodson's experience at Harvard was obviously not a fool's error. He did earn his PhD degree. Years later, however, Woodson would confess that it took him 20 years to recover from the miseducation that he received at Harvard. It is firmly believed by those who were Woodson's comrades, or those individuals who have been labeled as Woodson scholars, or even those persons who became the heirs of the association that Woodson founded in 1915, that the Harvard-trained historian made a distinct and calculated attempt to counter the prevailing view held by whites at the time, that the Negro not only failed to make a significant contribution to world or American history, but that he was largely a man without a past. What is particularly interesting to note here also is that the same year, 1915, that Woodson and 4 other African Americans founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, D.W. Griffith produced the film entitled The Birth of a Nation. While the film itself earned Griffith praise and accolades as a pioneer and leader in the history of motion pictures, its racist and degrading depiction of African Americans has distinguished it as probably the most historically devastating cinematic production on African Americans in the annals of Hollywood's history. While President Woodrow Wilson is reported to have lavished praise on the film at a special White House screening, exclaiming that it was, I quote, like writing history with lightning, end of quote, the film was widely criticized across the United States by both Blacks and whites. Woodson was never successful in creating an America where Blacks and whites would see each other as fellow human beings. But he did more than any other African American before or after him to help us, both Blacks and whites, overcome the dark history of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. When he died in 1950 at the age of 74, he had created an organization, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which is now 107 years old. He had published more than a dozen books of his own and had armed future warriors with the basic historical truths to believe that miseducation was neither a fatal or incurable disease. And today, I am proud to salute Dr. Woodson as a historian and scholar who, in the words of one who assessed Woodson's legacy, said that this historian, the founder of Negro History Week, now Black History Month, probably did more than any single person to rescue Negro history from oblivion. A similar question we face today is this: what shall we do to ensure that Dr. Woodson's pioneering work and legacy, the seeds that he planted, do not fall on stony ground? In this instance, I must challenge my white Americans, my fellow white Americans, to redouble your efforts, some of which are already impressive, and to work even harder today than you have in the past, to understand that we African Americans are your neighbors, fellow human beings, not chattel property, not a subspecies of the human family, not the beast portrayed in the film Birth of a Nation, not the Black savages lynched and burned without due process of the law, or even a class of people to be viciously murdered, as we all witnessed in the May 25th, 2020 death of George Floyd. We are not a perfect people, but like you, we are Americans and members of the human family. What Blacks and whites have witnessed even during the last half of the 20th century are piles of grievances and wrongs that still beg, do Black lives matter? At the beginning of my work in the profession of history, during the last quarter of the 20th century, I was filled with the optimism expressed in one of Langston Hughes' poems, I Too, which proclaimed, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am American. My optimism is not dead, yet it could be strengthened and refreshed by the assurance of men and women in this century who believe that we may yet give birth to a nation seemingly envisioned by our founding fathers, who proclaimed in the magnificent words of our Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I must caution white Americans that the contemporary words of diversity and inclusion still ring hollow in a nation with a deepening caste system and one still seemingly committed to a bifurcated definition of the American dream. As I would begin my course on African American history, which I taught here at ECU for 34 years, I would read a statement to students about what the course could mean to both Blacks and whites. A white historian wrote way back in 1969 in the Journal of Negro History that a course in Black history might fulfill different needs for both Blacks and whites. As this Georgian trained at the universities of South Carolina and California at Los Angeles, stated, and I quote, "I'm not advocating segregated history, one version of American history for whites and another for blacks. I'm suggesting that cultural differences and social realities are such that Negro history might fulfill different psychological needs or necessities for the two races. It might also satisfy certain social and political imperatives of the larger society," end of quote. This historian continues, "It is my surmise," and I'm quoting here, "that Black youth are in need of nothing as much as a secure sense of personal identity, self-confidence, and racial pride. A racial minority in a society which deals harshly with them, they are too often unable to articulate satisfactory answers to the questions, who am I? What is my group identity? What is my racial heritage? Too often, they succumb to a sort of brainwashing which denies them the ego strength that comes from self-awareness, self-knowledge, and the security of group identity. The study of Negro history should help them achieve these things as the study of American history helps whites. Whites will derive benefits of an entirely different sort from this study of Negro history. Insofar as race is concerned, the white man's problem is not ego weakness and psychological emasculation, but an overriding superiority complex. The white American needs a more balanced view of racial history, of racial differences, of race itself. He sorely needs a better understanding of racism, the mechanics of racial discrimination, and how these have operated historically to elevate whites and repress Blacks. He needs, in other words, a generous dose of racial realism and modesty. He needs to know that the nation's professions of democracy, equality, and opportunity have never applied equally to Negroes. He needs to know that the law, the Constitution, and government, capitalism, and free enterprise, the church and the school, indeed, public policy in general, have all been used to deny Black men the privileges and responsibilities of citizenship and to deprive them of access to what white men call the American dream. He needs to know this and much more. Here I submit that Black History Month, like a specific course in African American history, remains invaluable for white Americans who wish to make themselves whole and to continue their effort to value and understand their African American neighbors as themselves. Finally, I want to make some comments on the current plight of African Americans since the botched attempt to integrate America's public schools. What occurred some 16 years after the historic Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954 was a development that held great promise for African Americans. Since the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, when the US Supreme Court set forth the separate but equal doctrine, which held that separate but equal facilities were not unconstitutional, African Americans struggled to make the point that separate Black and white schools were not equal, and that in separate Black schools, Black children were deprived of due process and equal protection of the laws provided all American citizens. Charles Hamilton Houston, a Harvard University trained lawyer, compiled the essential data to document the wide disparities between separate Black and white schools and left it for one of his prize students, mainly Thurgood Marshall. He left this information for Marshall to use in arguing the case before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954. Charles Hamilton Houston had died in 1950 of a heart attack. Black Americans roundly applauded the Brown decision and believed that it would provide Black children the same educational opportunities enjoyed by their white peers. But it was W.E.B. Du Bois who perhaps offered the best assessment of the Brown decision, noting some of its dangerous and harmful side effects. In an article titled 200 Years of Segregated Schools, published in 1955, 1 year after the Brown decision, Du Bois wrote, and I quote, "This decision, even with its delayed implementation and in accordance with the widespread American contempt of law, the decision faces Negroes with a cruel dilemma. They want their children educated. That is a must, else they continue in semi-slavery. Nevertheless," Du Bois continued, "yet with successfully mixed schools, they know what their children must suffer for years from Southern white teachers, from white hoodlums who sit beside them, and under school authorities, from janitors to superintendents who hate and despise them. They know, dear God, how they know. Yet they also know that they themselves must accept this verdict and even insist on it. They dare not do otherwise, for equality is what they have demanded for 250 years, and now that a further push has been achieved with dirty accompaniments, they must accept it in justice to generations to come, white and Black." This is the price of liberty, Du Bois continued. This is the cost of oppression. And still more specifically, Du Bois noted, the best of Negro teachers will largely go because they will not and cannot teach what many white folks will want taught. Much teaching of Negro history will leave the school, and with it, that brave story of Negro resistance. It would take nearly 2 decades for African Americans generally and others to begin to question the historical fruit of school desegregation. According to Gary Orfield of the Desegregation Project, which began at Harvard but later relocated to UCLA, the South is much more integrated today than it was before the Civil Rights Revolution. But it is moving backward at an accelerated rate. And as late as 2020, this white educator and others offered this mixed report, stating that most Americans, including many people of color, believe that we have made progress and solved most of the problems or know how to solve them in segregated schools. Some believe that we tried and failed. Some believe that we have gone too far and been unfair to whites. Still, the truth of the matter is that in our cities, where we place emphasis on diversity, we still segregate most people of color in inferior schools. Historian Robert Pratt, who studied the desegregation process in Richmond, Virginia, and published a book titled The Color of Their Skin, Education and Race in Richmond, Virginia, 1954 to 1989, has characterized the desegregation process there as a shameful legacy. In another place, Professor Robert Lowe tells us that in the South, there was the loss of 30,000 Black teachers, and in some states, as many as 90% of Black principals. And there was the loss of many high schools and their cultural traditions. Moreover, this scholar states that ironically, institutions that helped create the capacity to litigate Brown and launch the civil rights movement were in many cases destroyed and compromised by desegregation. A rather clear observation that is now emerging from the evidence on school desegregation since Brown is that middle-class whites have avoided desegregation by moving to the suburbs, where they have typically opposed increased funding to urban schools. And when they have accepted desegregation, it has been on terms favorable to them. The favorability of such terms have indeed pushed Professor Lowe of Marquette University and the founder of Rethinking Schools to conclude that in a final irony, whites arguably are the main beneficiaries of desegregated schools today. Now, it is my contention that if whites were indeed the major beneficiaries of school desegregation, and it appears that they were, then this botched process, which did offer some material and technical advantages to Black students, was nevertheless a costly social and psychological experiment for the latter group. In desegregated schools, which, as Du Bois noted in his prophetic observation of the dirty accompaniments of Brown, Black students not only lost important role models who could help them navigate the thorny issues of race, gender, and class, but also a history of themselves, their culture, and traditions. In fact, students such as Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas, the Little Rock Nine of Little Rock Central High School, Ruby Bridges of New Orleans, and other Black students who were picked to lead the fight in school desegregation were heroes, warriors, and survivors. But their experience as survivors probably pale in comparison to the damages done to their souls and overall healthy conception of themselves. The cost here is still unknown in precise terms, but such a devastating blow to childhood development, I believe, led invariably to the school to prison pipeline, the growth of a larger Black underclass or caste system than existed at any time since the death of chattel slavery, and a larger number of African-American adults under correctional control than were enslaved in 1850. That's what Michelle Alexander talks about in the new Jim Crow. Co-sponsors in these developments are we African-Americans ourselves. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, for example, African-Americans became so engaged in fighting the external forces of racism and Jim Crow segregation until they neglected to devote sufficient time and energy to rearing their own children. Hence, too many children who came of age during the late 1960s and early 70s were not tethered to the old-fashioned ways and habits of their fathers and mothers. In fact, as a new world of freedom from the restrictive laws of Jim Crow segregation opened for the first time to Blacks and whites, too many Black adults and their children left home, their values, traditions, and racial heritage to explore the larger world of whites and their world of privileges and different societal norms. And now it has become evident to some of us African Americans that we are now living in the midst of young, vibrant, and talented African Americans whose values and self-conceptions are so perplexing that they appear lost to us when measured by the old norms of their African American forefathers and mothers. Individuals who knew the words of lift every voice and sing, and who also knew the meaning of what the staple singers had in mind when they sang, respect yourself. Almost there, John. The high number of African Americans murdering each other, the high rate of African American suicides, and the overall disrespect that too many young African Americans have for themselves and others are totally new developments to generations born before Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. So today, I am calling on us, African Americans, to redouble our efforts to launch a nationwide campaign to teach our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren new lessons on African American history and traditions. And then say to them, as did our brother George Benson and sister Whitney Houston said in song, I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride to make it easier. Let the children's laughter remind us of how we used to be. And that's the greatest love of all. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, David. What a talk. Now for the question and answer session, discussion session. For those of you attending virtually, we're going to field the questions from those here in person first. And then if time permits, we'll turn to those submitted online. And if it doesn't, we'll answer them eventually if it requires time beyond the confines of the allotted hour and a half. So first of all, are there any questions from the audience, the live audience for David? Karen, I believe I saw your hand first. Go ahead.
David, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see.
Yeah.
That speech was just, that talk was just so passionately delivered, and it was so rooted in historicizing African American experience and white experience as well. I really appreciate what you had to say.
Okay.
I wonder if you would comment on Black Lives Matter movement and how the Black Lives Matter movement can help to revive some of the things that you are talking about.
I think was an important development, not as rooted in the history of African Americans as some of us wish for, but it was an indication that this generation of African Americans recognized that they were devalued. Now, we are still wanting to see how that the movement will spill over into changing the voting habits of young African Americans, how it will affect this high rate of murder in African American communities, Chicago, Missouri, and other places. Okay, and to some extent, we saw it apparently coming of age with the George Floyd murder. But it has, to some extent, it appears to me, floundered since that development. And so the jury is still out on Black Lives Matter as a movement, but it certainly was an important development and remains an important development.
I believe Robert was next. Go ahead, Bob.
Kind of a comment and a question. I grew up in the 50s and 60s in Greenville. My family goes back at least 5 generations in Bucks County. So I walked through a lot of history as you did your talk. I walked through some of my family's history. One thing that I saw in Greenville, and I don't know, were you here in the 60s?
No.
One thing that happened in addition to desegregation, which happened from the mid to the late 60s, I was part of that. We were on national news at Rhode Island due to the riots that we had. But what preceded that, and I think really set things off on the wrong foot, was something called urban renewal, where there were Black communities that were completely demolished. The one down on the riverfront is one example. There were others. You kind of alluded to that in your talk, but you didn't refer specifically to it. I'm wondering what you might think about how that gets turned around in our day, because a lot of the housing, a lot of it starts with what side of town housing, what kind of housing you have, whether you grew up in the projects. How can we, and a lot of those, that's still around, that's still with us. How can we reverse those trends?
Right. I am familiar with those developments that some of the planners call urban renewal. And some of us in those communities refer to that as urban removal, displacement. And that needs to be looked at alongside a development now that's taking place called gentrification, where whites left the cities, the inner cities like Atlanta and other places, Washington, D.C., and now they're coming back into those cities, and they are pushing some other folk out to get out. We need these spaces so that we can be close to the inner workings of downtown cities. And I think what happens here is something that we've looked at during the school desegregation process, is that African Americans have not always been as attentive as they should have been or should be to these economic developments. We've become more concerned about consumerism, spending them a dollar in a restaurant than creating vehicles whereby we could earn a dollar. And so that part of what some folk would refer to as economic nationalism, got pushed aside. So you would end up with situations like we see, moving a little fast here now, like in the NFL, where 70% of the players, are African Americans, but 32 teams. Coaches, you have one coach until just recently. Something is wrong with that picture, and these are folk who could here in Alabama roll tide, with the program there, but they could not here in the same way. The case 2013, Shelby versus Holden, coming out of the state of Alabama, which gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Or in some of these same places, folk are not hearing what's happening after the former president got so angry when he lost those 2 elections, the presidential election and a Senate race in Georgia. And now, these legislatures in states other than Georgia seem to be just going crazy. to suppress the votes of Black and brown people. But if we do not pay attention to the economic aspects of American life and the human rights of individuals, we're not going to get this thing right by just focusing on the civil rights and consumerism and all of that. So it's paying attention to the economic piece of the pie, as opposed to looking at artificial things like bling bling and so forth and so on. Now that's what way back Booker T. Washington said when folk were just leaving slavery. In his 1895 address, he says, we need to pay attention to these things of substance, owning some land, purchasing some land and developing a truck farm, as opposed to these artificial gewgaws of life, and all of that. These things that do not have much value. And Marcus Garvey came to this country primarily to meet Mr. Booker T. Washington in 1916, because he referred to Booker T. Washington, we refer to him as a conservative African-American, but he referred to Marcus Garvey as an economic nationalist. And that's what Woodson was about. Some of the economic principles, if you read Carter G. Woodson's book on the miseducation of the Negro, which he published in 1933, he is blasting the so-called talented 10th, upper class African Americans for not doing enough to uplift the masses and to provide leadership. He even questioned the existence of a lot of historically Black colleges and universities because they were not addressing some of these fundamental issues. Okay, so I appreciate your point, but history can repeat itself. It can show up in different forms as it showed up after the Reconstruction period. Slavery by another name is still slavery. It's still oppression. And when you do not pay attention to the economic factors, economic forces, you can be re-enslaved all over again, and you can be accomplices in your own enslavement.
The other Bob, go ahead.
Dr. Dennard, thank you. And, I'm a faith-based leader, and we've talked
Yes.
many times.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more as a Black educator speaking to a white minister. This critical race theory that seems to be part of the white lash after George Floyd's death, I really felt that it was a new movement, a grassroots movement, where maybe the consciousness of whites would begin to see the plight of our sisters and brothers. And you often have spoken, I will repeat it again and again. You taught us with the Human Relations Council some years ago that while we've come a long way with civil rights, we have a long way to go with human rights. And I say that because for me, my transformation, realizing that I have racism in my DNA just by who I am. It's like my arthritis.
Right.
It's with preventive medicine, you can manage it and take care of it.
Right.
But what perplexes me is that I've come to realize that America's original sin is not racism. It's white supremacy. And many white folks, including good faith-based folks that I have known through the years, they break out in a rash, start talking a little bit too much about something like white racism and owning. A question like, how do we repay? Will we ever be able to repay our Black sisters and brothers for what they have done for
for America to be where it is today, when you think about how buildings like the Capitol and the White House, but the white fragility that we talked about seems to have grown more with the death of George Floyd and the movement. And I'm concerned about this critical race theory because as a white faith-based leader, that needs to be confronted because that is gaining more and more steam as a way to suppress education. So I'll stop right there.
Okay, I appreciate your comments there. And I think it would be beneficial for white Americans to read Martin King's letter from a Birmingham jail, 1963. And then to come forward and look at what Robin DiAngelo is saying in her most recent book, Nice Racism. And Dr. King and DiAngelo, they're talking about white progressives, white moderates, who would say in some cases, I'm not racist, some of my best friends are, I'd ask them, well, when have you had this friend over recently, when you have this friend in your wedding, what kind of interaction do you have with these folks? And see the church, the clergy, Dr. King was critical of the clergy, and Carter G. Woodson was critical of the clergy. We have to be very critical of this clergy in the African American community that may be preaching a kind of theology of prosperity, as opposed to a Black theology of liberation. But back to your point on critical race theory. That's a Republican-created boogeyman, to divert attention away from real issues that should be addressed. Why make so much fuss about critical race theory being taught in public schools? I haven't found any evidence where it's ever been taught. Wasn't even taught in Black schools before the 1960s. I wouldn't be here today, perhaps, had it been taught. If folk had told me about the systemic and the permanence of racism in this society, I'm not so sure I would have wanted to learn the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And I wouldn't have learned, Declaration of Independence and some of these other things, but no one was teaching us about how permanent and mean-spirited these white Georgians were when I was coming of age, They were saying, in other words, well, this is bad for the moment, but we'll overcome, we'll get over it by and by, without naming who these, and you see during the Brown versus Board of Education decision, we just held out this optimism, this hope here, and we're sending our kids to schools to be taught by these folk who are just mean-spirited. And the massive resistance that we would see in Virginia with Senator Byrd, and all of these folk, what they said about the Brown. Said, are you oblivious to what's going on here, African Americans? And we dropped out of that process. We didn't attend the schools to look after our kids when they were placed in these desegregated schools. We didn't attend the schools afterward. I was PTA president for a school here. There was 60% African American. And on PTA meeting night, it would be 99% white. Where are the parents? So we have to take blame for some of this, but this critical race theory is just a Republican created boogeyman. But now, this is something that started in the 1970s with Derek Bell in the law schools, you know, and he wrote a book in 1992, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And the subtitle was The Permanence, you know, of racism and all that. So these guys, Derek Bell and some other persons were saying that despite our struggles and all of that, racism is so permanent. It's almost irremovable. It's almost like Isabel Wicker is saying now, we've gotten away from class. We're talking about a caste system that some folk are just born and it's hardened and all of that. So critical race theory, no one would teach these youngsters that they are the victims of parents who created a post-genocidal America, you know, and all of that. But we do want to teach them some history so that they will know what happened to the indigenous folk and what they need to know about the slavery and all of that. But we've been doing it in a way that would be appropriate for persons at their stage of growth and development, you know. But these persons now are trying to scare the bejesus out of folk with this so-called boogeyman. So you're looking for something, just like they say, you didn't win the election and it's a loss, you know, some votes. It was stolen from us, you know. But where are these votes? We've had all kind of counts being conducted, you know. And where are these missing votes and all of that? Where's the fraud in these elections that would justify some of what's being done in these states now? So I would say that well-meaning, progressive-minded whites, you know, should look away from that and say there's no substance there, you know. And so we should not go off fighting these invisible boogeymen and not pay attention to what we need when we talk about minimum wage being raised or the gun violence, you know, the Sandy Hooks and all these things. Or what's happening to women. We're trying to reverse Roe v. Wade, you know, now and all of that, so that we can take control over women's reproductive rights all over again, you know. So it's like this, and we've seen it in the African-American historical experience. It's like a ride on a roller coaster. You're up and down, as opposed to making this sustained progress. And we will just have to, look at the record here. Critical race theory is, as I say, I view it as a Republican created boogeyman.
Thank you, David. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Dennard. Good to see you again.
Yes.
You spoke early on a word wholeness, Dr. And we talked about with black with desegregation, that black students really focus on the dominant culture, the white culture and traditions and so forth. In many ways have shown great ability in that area, but in the dominant, in that next stage of becoming skilled there's now this idea of intersectionality. The word is something I haven't heard of, 3 years ago. But that, as Dr. Barber would say, third reconstruction, isn't there hope in actually expanding the capability of the Black community, if they don't lose their roots, in being able to join with others to claim the humanity of all manner of people, including themselves, and have allies against what's.
Right. It's a bit tricky here. And Carter Woodson was trying to address that issue. And Du Bois was trying to address that. He said, we want equality, but this equality that came with the Brown versus Board of Education is going to have some dirty accompaniments, dirty side effects. What are you going to do with the loss of your history for world humanity? Okay? Something that you don't live. Okay, let me give you two examples here. When I started college, historically Black school, I was preparing to become a social studies teacher. I was being taught Chinese history, European history, Russian history, everybody's history except my history. I was actually being educated away from myself. And we had to, a few of us, took it upon ourselves to say to some administrators, indirectly at least, that if they did not find a way to offer a course in African-American history, which was Negro history then, this school probably would no longer exist. Something would happen to it. And we did get a course offered in African-American history. And that allowed me then to, first of all, relate to myself before I could relate to somebody else out in the larger world, and develop my healthy self-esteem and self-concept and all of that. Because you can surround individuals with all these material benefits and all of that, but if they have an uncertain view of who they are and how they fit into this, there's an emptiness inside. And I think that may account for some of the problems that we are seeing with these students who were products of the Botch desegregation experience. Now, yes, I need to stay here, John says.
Excuse me.
And the second part of your question, I think, is that and I wanted to address this way. There was a folk tale about desegregation, desegregated Negro. After this person learned that desegregation had occurred, he went down to his favorite restaurant, And he went into the restaurant and looked at the menu, and he asked the waiter, said, "Do you have any collard greens?" He said, "No." "Do you have any ham hocks?" "No." He went on down the list, but he discovered then that it was none of the food that he was accustomed to eating. So he said, "You folk are not ready for integration." And what happened in the school system, we went into the public schools, left our stuff outside. It's like if I were to be invited to my colleague, Dr. Zipp's, a party, and she said, "Well, it's going to be a potluck." I mean, that's old school stuff. You all can, bring this dish or bring this dish, or you don't have to bring anything. But I would feel better if she allowed me to bring something so that I can share. But if she said, "Just come on and sample all of my food and eat my food and all of that and be made over the way I'm going to make you," I would be a little concerned about that. Okay. And that's what happened in the public schools. You leave your school and all your traditions, all your culture, and you come in to be made over by these folks. And so kids come out of those schools with a deeper notion of white is right and it's great and all of that. So Carter Woodson would say that's when you were taught to worship Europe and whiteness and to despise Africa and blackness. That's the crux of the miseducation here. These professional folk who were trained at Harvard, Howard University, and all these places, they'd come out saying that they could not waste their time teaching African-American history or Black history because there's no respect for that. I had to teach European history. I got to do something that's valued by whites. And so we lost ourselves. The same process will hold true for women, that we say. As far as when they go higher up the ladder, some studies would show that they feel worse about themselves and their value because they've learned more about the greatness of white men and all that they've accomplished, whether you're reading, literature and all of that, you have all of the great man stories, what these folk have done. What about what you've accomplished? We're trying to change that now, but it's still difficult. Okay? So that's the crux of what happened. It is botched desegregation process. It's not integration. See, integration would have been that shadow, okay? That hasn't happened yet. So I think that's where some of that fallout is trickling down now to the millennials. High suicide rates, even for teens, and the devaluation of Black life, I came up under official Jim Crow segregation with parents who had not attended Harvard, had not even graduated from high school. But I learned something about the value of life, the sacredness of life, and not harming myself or harming others. And that was taught, as Carter Woodson, as the biographer was saying, that Carter Woodson taught his children, don't take things from whites, don't let them call you out of your name and all of that, because that starts to destroy your self-respect, your integrity, your dignity. And you can give me a computer, but if I don't have a good sense of who I am, I'm not going to use that computer effectively. And it may mean that I would go the way of this young girl who recently, we have the evidence, Chelsea, who jumped from, she's 30 years old. She has a law degree. She's former Miss USA. Her law degree, BS, not BS, master's degree from Wake Forest University. That's not just any school that you look up and attend, But she's thinking, according to the evidence that we see, that she's not done enough, she's not accomplished enough. So what's wrong with you? But that's if you are not tethered to some of these older values in the African-American community that may come out of this song, lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring, stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening road and all of that. Lest we forget, there's something in that song, that would instill some basis for struggling. So if the story of Black resistance goes out of the schools during desegregation, how are you going to learn about these folk who were movers and shakers and made a way out of supposedly no way, without destroying themselves or destroying others? So did I come close to? Okay.
Are there any other questions, comments? If not, we'll turn just briefly. If you come up with something, please don't hesitate to
to ask. We have a couple here, but one of them you've already addressed. It's about critical race theory. So we'll skip that. It was, what are your thoughts on critical race theory? I think that has been adequately addressed. Then another, asking from the Daily Reflector, on a local level, how can Black history be better taught and given a platform? On a local level.
On the local level, we simply have to work to change the curriculum offerings, okay? So that we'll address issues that we talk about at college and universities on the Black diaspora, Africa, what happened, when those societies were disrupted by the slave trade. What were those societies like before the start of the slave trade? And what happened to individuals during the period of slavery? Okay. See, in a lot of the public schools, is my understanding, we teach folk about Rosa Parks and all of that. They come in during the Civil War to some extent. We were talking about Abraham Lincoln and the Great Emancipator. They go away and they don't come back again to the civil rights movement. African Americans were moving and active at every stage of America's growth and development. Westward March, all of that. Progressive period, they were there, But if you get off on this notion that Woodrow Wilson, who's a historian, the president, he'd been leader of Princeton University, and he says a film like The Birth of a Nation is history writ in lightning. Man, what's your sense of history? But you can't teach something that you do not understand. And too many of our public school teachers didn't take my course in African American history. They're not taking other courses in African American, and they're getting knowledge about African Americans and saying, I'm not racist because I listen to rap music, hip hop, and I play on basketball team or football team with African Americans and all of that. But they do not really have real understanding of these individuals. And that's what we have to try to instill in students, so that when you come out of high school, you will know what you need to know to be grounded. And then you can say that I understand you, but I still don't like you. But when folk don't like you and they don't understand you, and that's awful. And we know that most adolescents, their values are formed before they get to ECU, before they come. So I cannot teach them to change their ways without maybe doing a lobotomy on them if they have been taught, that stay away from these folk, or they're criminals, they're murderers, they're no good, and all of that. Based on the contemporary images that you may see, these buffoons, these new buffoons that we see. So I think this is where parents have to get involved. Like I got involved in that PTA debacle, when it came my turn to be president of PTA, these women there, and they meant well, but they said, Dr. Dennard, you don't have time to be PTA president. You're working at ECU, you got to go off and do research on all these topics and all that. I said, but I have a kid in this school, and that's my investment, and I have to look after my investment. So what happened if I write all of these books and lose my kids? I've lost everything. So I'm saying you have to prioritize, you know. And I said, well, I'm going to become PTA president and I'm going to continue to work at ECU and I'm going to work on all of it, you know. But I'm thinking about protecting my investment here and not leaving it in your hands, you know. So there's something I can do. So I think you have to remain engaged. And Du Bois would say in his Souls of Black Folk, he's an aggressive person in all respects. We see folk on the football field on the gridiron. I mean, they are aggressive. They can find ways like Aaron Donald to lay hands on Burroughs, you know. He didn't get to him most of the early game, but he got to him at that critical point, you know. Du Bois would say, the sky was bluish when I could beat my playmates at test time, at a foot race, or even beat their stringy heads. So he was a competitor. He wanted to best them test time at, you know, foot race, or even best them if you went to fisticuffs. Woodson says, fight to the limit, you know, to preserve your dignity and all of that. So if we instill in our children at home, certain values and certain principles, you know, and if we model those principles and all of that, they would learn from us. And this is where I'm saying these folk lost a lot of these role models during the desegregation of schools, because Johnny, who is Black, may misbehave according to the teacher who doesn't really understand Johnny. He's written up. And that starts this trek, you know, for being charged with misbehaving. And it goes on until he ends up in prison and all of that. Now, Johnny, who is white, whose teacher knows that, well, boys will be boys, and that's just Johnny being Johnny, because you understand his culture, you understand, you know, something about him, and you value him, so you wouldn't allow certain things to happen to him, you know, that you would allow to happen to kids that you don't know and you don't value. I've had colleagues tell me that the way the police officers here in Greenville behaved, you know, when his kid acted up, you know, they behaved like, you know, this is my neighbor, or this is the son of my neighbor. And so I'm going to do this as opposed to doing that. But he sees my kid and he's not my neighbor, and he doesn't value my kid as he values his own son, then he takes a different course of action. So I think when we get to the point where we understand each other as fellow human beings, as neighbors, you know, and that's what Christians have to say. Who is your neighbor? That's what Jesus asked. Who is your neighbor? And so we have to think about, you know, when we learn all that we can about each other and our neighbors, you know, we would do unto others as we would have them do unto us. You know, we use the same measuring stick, you know, okay? But we're not there yet, but I hope we're still moving, and it's work to be done on both sides. My side, I've learned to survive this stuff, but I've not been in position to make policies, you know? So if we do not, you know, work to, as Mandela said in his autobiography, he said, one of the things I learned at the end of this struggle, that we had not done enough to educate the oppressor. See, we had learned to survive and educate ourselves, but we had not educated the oppressor. And that's what we haven't done here, to see us as fellow human beings, as neighbors, and that's what we can do.
Well, it is 5:30. Somehow that 30-minute talk of ours really has filled up the time allotted. And I don't want to cut anything short, but at the same time, I understand that some of you might have other obligations. Let me just check the questions and answers here. There is one more. What do you like in our current socio-political climate? What do you liken in our current socio-political climate to the redemption era that followed Reconstruction? What is it in today's socio-political climate that reminds you of the redemption, or that you see resonance in relation to the redemption?
It's this reversal that we are experiencing. After the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, after the end of Reconstruction, there was an effort to take that away. Now we could see after the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed, there's an effort to destroy that. 2013 Shelby versus Holden coming out of Alabama is basically gutted that, So we're being pushed back toward that value. And so what happens sometimes when there is, in the large community can say, we elected President Obama and re-elected him, so we're not racist, we're not this. But look at the reaction that comes after that. And the behavior and deportment of this person. And he's still not willing to accept defeat at the hands of the American people. Okay, so if you have that a kind of a victory, and then you have this stage that follows it, as a repressive period, it's like you're on a mountain and you lose it. So you gotta, folk would say in the civil rights movement, for example, we who believe in freedom cannot rest, and that's what Americans know, Bush would say, it's better for us to fight the terrorists over there rather than for us to have to fight them here. But you must remain engaged and you must remain vigilant, because folk who have witnessed your growth and your development are concerned about minimizing or taking away that growth and development at some instances. And that's what women know. We talked about how women were effective with their strategies of balking, this Robert Bork, when it came turn for him to be appointed to the Supreme Court, these women rose up and balked him, and talked about how terrible he was and all of that, and turned him away, okay? So what would have happened had they gone to sleep on Robert Bork, as we went to sleep on Clarence Thomas, ever regret that. And now this president is saying, he said before he was elected, that if elected, I will appoint a Black woman to the Supreme Court. And now you see all of the critical comments coming out of certain areas, about this process. So, but we just have to remain engaged and see ourselves, as we the people, and make an effort to create a more perfect union, that. And we cannot assume that we can leave what we should do to others, because it may not get done, okay? And I think there are folk of goodwill, but they just have not thought that they should always keep their hand on the plow in some ways. And we're learning that if you take your hand off the plow, that plow can go in some strange directions, Okay.
Okay, I thank you for coming this afternoon. For those of you who are still with us virtually, and there were over 140 people who, by the way, registered for this virtually. So the in-person turnout is only a small fraction of the total broadcast of Dr. Dennard's message. We thank you online and here, and most especially we thank Dr. Dennard for that powerful, impassioned presentation, and hope that you will support the Pitt County Historical Society in the future going forward with our programs. And as I am given to say, if you're not a member already, we would like for you to join and support us in our efforts to encourage historical learning and discourse. Thank you and have a good afternoon. And with that, we'll just put this to conclusion.